lacrimosa di Eriglia.
Requiem aeternam. Amen.
The world dissolves in ashes. A new era begins in fire and dust.
The sands of time consume the towers. The old way.
Yo, what's up, fam? How y'all doing? Money chasers, truth chasers, and everyone in between. You know, this is the RusNkaZ Show, and I'm your host, BamBam. Today, I want to get into something real deep, something that a lot of people don't want to talk about because they don't want to be politically incorrect. And because it does matter to our future kids and Western civilization, I want to talk about the oil and water. The deep dive into the compatibility of Islam and the West. How compatible is Islam and the West is what I want to take apart the argument, smash it like two potatoes, and see if there is such thing as compatibility between Islam and the West. Take it apart to its core fundamentals of when and how the legality of it, the actual structure, the fundamentals, the legality of written word. And I want to take it apart and compare the two and see if they are actually in fact compatible like some say, or incompatible like others say. This is going to be an honest breakdown and comparison as well as contrast. So if you do not like the subject, switch the channel. But for those of you who are staying, thank you. Please subscribe, like, and comment, and ring that bell notification for future episodes. But without any further ado, let's go.
This is the RusNkaZ Show. Bam Bam calling shots like a maestro. This is the RusNkaZ Show, where the wild and the crazy grow. Turn it up, feel the rhythm flow. Hustle rock, bam bam. Let's go, let's go.
So what's good, people? Welcome back to the RusNkaZ Show. I'm your host, BamBam, like I said. And if you're listening to this in your car, grip the wheel a little tighter. If you're at the gym, put some more weight on the bar, because today we're not playing games. We're not doing the fluff. We're not doing the celebrity gossip hour. We are going into the belly of the beast. For the next few hours, we are conducting a forensic investigation, a deep dive autopsy of the single most explosive, taboo, and uncomfortable topic in Western civilization. I'm talking about the narrative we have been fed for 30 years, the narrative of coexistence, the narrative of multiculturalism, the idea that capitalist democratic republic of the West and the ancient immutable system of Islam are just two different flavors of the same human experience. What if I told you that was a lie? What if I told you that when you strip away the politeness, when you ignore the diversity seminars, and when you actually read the legal text, look at the bank ledgers, and walk the streets of in days, what you find isn't compatibility. What you find is matter and antimatter. What you find is oil and water. You can shake that jar as hard as you want. You can mandate integration. You can pass laws. But the second you stop shaking, they separate, they divide, because at the molecular level, at the level of sovereignty, economics, and social tolerance, they are built on completely different operating systems. We have piles of research here. We've got court cases from Oklahoma to London. We've got bylaws of the London Metal Exchange. We've got the minutes from city council meetings in Michigan. We've got the tragic stories of women fleeing Al-Qaeda husbands in Canada. We're going to weave this all together into one massive report. So buckle up, pour a drink, or like I say, get a Dr. Pepper with strawberries and cream. And let's get into the oil and water report, y'all. Part 1. When God votes against the people. To understand why gears grind when you try to mesh Islam with Western democracy, you have to look at the engine block. You have to look at the concept of sovereignty. In the West, in the United States, the UK, France, we operate on a very specific idea: popular sovereignty. We the people, it means that the supreme power resides in us. We decide tomorrow that the speed limit is 200 miles an hour, or that marriage includes 2 men, or that we want to tax billionaires at 99%. We can do that. Law is fluid. Law is man-made. Law evolves. Now, contrast that with the core political tenet of Islamism, Hakimiyyah. The theology of Hakimiyyah. Hakimiyyah translates to divine sovereignty. It is the idea that only legitimate lawgiver in the universe is God, not the parliament, not the Congress, not the Supreme Court, but Allah. This isn't just a religious preference. This is a political hardline. The architects of modern political Islam, guys like Abul Allah Maududi and Sayyid Qutb, laid this out explicitly. Maududi looked at Western democracy and didn't see freedom. He saw blasphemy. He argued that democracy is a form of tyranny because it allows the majority, 51% of the voters, to overrule the laws of God. If God says alcohol is forbidden and 51% of voters say it's legal, those voters have usurped God's authority. They have set themselves up as false idols. Think about the friction that creates. If you are a devout believer in Hakimiyyah, participating in a Western democracy is a contradiction. You are voting in a system that claims the right to legalize what your God has forbidden. Ibrahim Essa, a brilliant commentator, calls this the impossible relationship. He says the West is deluding itself. We have this fantasy that we can integrate political Islam into a civil state. We think, oh, just give them a parliament, give them a voice, and they'll become Jeffersonian Democrats. But Essa argues that this is mixing oil and water. The Islamists believe in divine sovereignty. The civil state believes in popular sovereignty. You cannot have two sovereigns in one state. Eventually, one must submit. The supremacy clause versus the Sharia. Let's bring it home to the US. We have the Constitution, Article 6, Clause 2, Supremacy Clause. It says, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And then you have Sharia. Now, you will hear apologists say, hey, BamBam, you're fear-mongering. Sharia is just about prayer and fasting. And sure, for many people it is, but Sharia is also a comprehensive legal system. It covers criminal law, family law, inheritance, warfare, and contracts. And here is where the incompatibility gets real. There is a concept in Islam called the covenant of security. It basically says that if a Muslim lives in a non-Muslim land, they should obey the laws of that land. Sounds good, right? Sounds compatible? Read the fine print, folks. Always read the fine print. That obedience is conditional. It holds as long as the secular law doesn't force the Muslim to violate a core command of God. But what happens when the definition of rights conflicts? Take the First Amendment, for example. Freedom of speech. In the West, that includes the right to blaspheme. You can draw a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. You can write a book calling religion a fairy tale. Constitution protects that. Under Sharia, blasphemy is a capital offense. There is no freedom to insult the Prophet. So if you are a Sharia adherent Muslim in the West, you are living in a state of constant cognitive dissonance. The supreme law of your country protects behavior that your supreme law, God, demands be punished by death. We saw this tension explode with the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and we see it every time there is a controversy over a cartoon or a book. The Oklahoma battleground, for example. This isn't just theoretical, it's hitting the courts. Look at Oklahoma. In 2010, they passed State Question 755. It was a constitutional amendment banning the use of Sharia law and international law in Oklahoma courts. Now, the liberals screamed, Racism! They said it was discriminatory and federal courts eventually struck it down. But why did it happen? Because people sensed this incompatibility. They looked at cases, family law cases, inheritance cases where Sharia principles were creeping in. Opponents argued that banning Sharia violates a Muslim's religious freedom. But proponents argued, if we allow Sharia to be considered, we are introducing a foreign legal code that inherently treats women and non-believers unequally. It's the classic Western dilemma. Does religious freedom include the freedom to practice a legal code that violates the rights of others? I ask you, citizenship versus dimitude. Let's go deeper into the social structure. Let's talk about citizenship. In a republic, we are equal. One person, one vote. It doesn't matter if you worship Jesus, Allah, the flying spaghetti monster, or nothing at all. We're all citizens. Historical Islam operates on a different hierarchy. In a true Islamic state, which is the goal of political Islam, society is divided. You have the Ummah, the believers, who are the full citizens. And then you have the Dhimmis. Dhimmitude is the status of protected people. Jews and Christians, historically, they were allowed to live and practice their faith, but they were second class. They paid a special tax called jizya. They were exempt from military service because they couldn't be trusted to fight for the Islamic State. They often couldn't hold high office. Their testimony in court was worth less than a Muslim's. Now modernists, guys like Fahmy Huwaidi, try to reframe this. They say, oh, dhimmitude is outdated. We believe in citizenship now. They try to argue that the jizya was just a tax for protection, like modern taxes. But look at the actions of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. When they briefly held power in Egypt, or when you look at their manifestos, they struggle with this. They have this concept of wilaya cobra, a major governance. They argue that non-Muslim cannot be the president of the prime minister of an Islamic state because the state's function is to uphold the faith. How can a Christian uphold Islam? In the West, we have had the Muslim mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. We have Muslim congresswoman, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. The Western system allows Muslims to rise to the very, very top. But does the Islamic system allow the reverse? Let me ask you. If the Western system allows Muslims to rise to the very, very top, but does the Islamic system allows the reverse? Can a Christian be a caliph? Can a Jew be the head of an Islamic republic? Absolutely not. The compatibility is a one-way street. The West is open, the Islamic political structure is closed. That is a fundamental, structural incompatibility. You cannot have a universal citizenship model mesh with the religious hierarchy model without one of them breaking a sovereignty conflict. Western Democratic Republic versus political Islamism, the friction point. What is the source of law? In Western world, it's we the people, popular sovereignty. Laws are malleable. Hakimiyyah is a divine sovereignty. Laws are immutable, Sharia. Irreconcilable. A voter cannot overturn God's law. In the Islamist view. Supreme authority, the constitution that secular courts interpret the law. The Quran and Sunnah, religious scholars interpret the law. The supremacy clash, Sharia claims jurisdiction over public life, conflicting with secular statutes. Status of people, universal citizenship, total equality under the law. Believer versus dhimmi, hierarchy based on faith, inequality. The concept of dhimmitude violates Western equal protection clauses. Free speech, absolute, includes right to blaspheme, mock religion. Restricted, blasphemy is a capital offense. Censorship, violence in response to cartoons, books. Rushdie and Hebdo. Part 2, money game. Capitalism with a beard. Alright, let's switch gears. We talked about the law. Now let's talk about the lifeblood of the West. Let's talk about the money. Paper, paper, money, money. The almighty dollar, the sterling, the euro. The Western economy is a capitalist engine, and the fuel of that engine is interest, credit, loans, risk pricing. The entire global financial system, from your mortgage to the national debt, is built on the idea that time has value and renting money costs money. Islam says haram, the prohibition of riba. Usury interest is absolute. You cannot charge it. You cannot pay it. The Quran equates dealing in interest to declaring war on God. What? So right there, you have a massive incompatibility. How can a devout Muslim participate in a system where every house, every car, every business loan is tainted by riba? Well, humanity is creative. And when you have a billion people who need to buy houses and start businesses, you find a loophole. Enter the fascinating, controversial, and frankly hilarious world of Islamic banking. Critics call it capitalism with a beard. Some call it smoke and mirrors. I call it the greatest magic trick in financial history. The Tuwamuk fiction, the copper shuffle. Critics call it capitalism with a beard. Some call it smoke and mirrors. I call it the greatest magic trick in financial history. The Waruk fiction, the copper shuffle. I want to walk you through a specific transaction. If you want to understand why Islamic economics is currently just a shadow of Western capitalism, you have to understand Tawarruk, also known as commodity murabaha. Let's say you're a Muslim in London. You need 10,000 euros cash to pay off a debt or start a business. You can't go to Barclays and get a personal loan because that's interest. Haram. So you go to an Islamic bank. Here is the gymnastics they perform to get you that money. The setup. The bank has a broker on the London Metal Exchange. They buy 10,000 worth of commodity, usually something like boring, like copper, zinc, or palm oil. The sale, the bank sells that pile of copper to you, the customer, but not for 10,000. They sell it to you for 11,000, and they say you can pay us later in installments over a year. Note, this is technically a sale, murabaha, not a loan. The 1,000 markup is profit, not interest. The flip, now you, the customer, own $10,000 worth of copper ingots sitting in a warehouse. You don't want copper. You can't pay your rent in zinc. You need cash. The cash out, so the bank, acting as your agent, immediately turns around and sells that copper back to the market or a third-party broker for the spot price of 10,000. The result, you have 10,000 cash in your account. You owe the bank 11,000. Do you guys follow that? Do you see what just happened? What? Mathematically, legally, financially, that is a loan with 10% interest. But because they moved some digital receipts for copper around the server in London for 3 milliseconds, it is labeled halal. What? Critics, and I'm talking about Islamic scholars, not just Westerners, call this a halal, legal fiction. It's a trick. It's a backdoor. You're obeying the letter of the law while completely violating the spirit of the law. You're mimicking the exact economic outcome of Western capitalism, but wrapping it in religious terminology. There was a case in UAE with a company called Dana Gas. They issued sukuk, Islamic bonds. When the bill came due, the company turned around and said, hey, actually, our own bonds are not Sharia compliant anymore. So strictly speaking, it would be a sin for us to pay you back. What? Can you imagine that in a New York court? Imagine Goldman Sachs saying, sorry, God says we can't pay you. It created absolute chaos. Western courts rely on contract certainty. What? Islamic finance introduces a layer of theological uncertainty that drives Western lawyers insane. It is an incompatibility of risk. The backdoor interest, criticism. This isn't just me talking. Look at the research. Snippet discusses how Islamic economics often lacks a clear ideological alternative to capitalism, so it resorts to copying it. Snippet it is from a forum where people are shouting. It's just interest in disguise. Even the models they use, like the Zubair diminishing balance model for mortgages, are just complex mathematical ways to benchmark against the LIBOR, London Interbank Offer Rate. Pure halal interest rate moves exactly in sync with the Federal Reserve's interest rate. Are you really operating a different system? Or are you just paying a compliance tax to feel better? This creates a massive drag on the economy. It's inefficient. It requires brokers, Sharia boards, and multiple contracts for what should be a simple click of a button. If the West is a Ferrari, the system is a Ferrari towing a trailer full of theological textbooks. It slows everything down. So, is it compatible? In theory, no. Interest versus no interest. In practice, it survives only by becoming the thing it hates. It assimilates into capitalism by becoming a hypocritical version of it. Part 3: The Social War. The Paradox of Tolerance. Now, we talked about law, we talked about money. Now we get to the streets, the culture, the vibe. This is where the rubber meets the road and where the friction turns into fire. The Western Democratic Republic is built on liberalism. And I don't mean Democrat versus Republican. I mean classical liberalism. John Locke, Mill, the idea of individual liberty, the idea that I can do what I want as long as I don't hurt you. This includes women's rights, gays' rights, trans rights, the right to wear a bikini, the right to drink a beer, the right to pray, the right to not pray. And this is where the oil and water analogy stops being a metaphor and starts being a head-on collision. Karl Popper and the Paradox. There is a philosopher named Karl Popper. In 1945, he wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies. He dropped a concept called the paradox of tolerance. He said, unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and the tolerance with them. Basically, if you're too nice to the bully takes over the playground. For decades, the West has operated on unlimited tolerance. We said, come on in, bring your culture, we tolerate everything. We assumed that by being nice, everyone else would become nice too. We assumed that if we welcomed the Islamists, they would eventually become liberals. We were wrong. The Hamtramck flip, a case study in irony. You want proof? Look at Hamtramck, Michigan. For years, the American left celebrated. It was true model city, the first Muslim majority city council in America. The liberal media was cheering. They thought, this is it, diversity, a rebuke to Donald Trump's America. They viewed the election of this all-Muslim council as a triumph of progressive intersectionality. The assumption, the lazy Western liberal assumption, was that all minorities are on the same team. They thought Muslims are a religious minority and LGBTQ people, a sexual minority, were natural allies against the white Christian patriarchy. Boy, did that narrative crash and burn. In June 2023, that democratically elected all-Muslim city council voted to ban the pride flag from city property. The liberals were in shock. What? They were crying betrayal. Former commissioners were suing, but the council, they didn't blink. Councilman Naeem just said, we want to respect the religious rights of our citizens. Councilman Mohammed Hassan mocked the outrage, saying to the LGBTQ activists, I'm working for the people, what the majority of the people like. Mayor Amir Ghalib defended the move as a neutrality resolution, saying this city doesn't discriminate, but government buildings belong to everyone and cannot be used by a specific group to promote special interests.
You what?
Yo, do you guys even see what just happened there? It was a jiu-jitsu move. When the Muslims were the minority in Hamtramck, they used the language of tolerance and rights to get a seat at the table. But the second they became the majority, they used the mechanism of democracy to enforce their own moral code, which is socially conservative and anti-LGBTQ. They essentially said, oh, thanks for the tolerance. Now that we are in charge, we're implementing our values. And this is the paradox of tolerance in 4K resolution for you. The West tolerated the intolerance until the intolerance had the votes to ban the symbols of tolerance. And that is what's happening. Dearborn and the grooming chants. It's not just flags. Look at Dearborn, Michigan. We saw school board meetings devolve into chaos. You had Muslim parents, many of whom vote Democrat, flooding the meetings, holding up signs, chanting against LGBTQ books in libraries. They were shouting about grooming. And here's the wildest part. They were using the exact same talking points as the MAGA Republicans. The intersectional left didn't know what to do. They watched their coalition of the oppressed fracture in real time. The Muslim parents were prioritizing their religious values, protecting children from what they see as sin, over the liberal value of inclusion. This proves the thesis: when the rubber meets the road, the religious allegiance, al-wala wala bara, trumps the political alliance. The Shia patrols and the street. In the US, it's happening in city halls. In the UK, it's happening on the street. A few years ago, we saw the rise of Sharia patrols in East London. Young men, hooded up, walking through the neighborhoods like Whitechapel. They were harassing women for wearing short skirts. They were knocking beers out of people's hands. They were shouting, "This is a Muslim area." They targeted people they perceived as gay. They targeted couples holding hands. Now, the East London Mosque came out and condemned them. They said it was unacceptable. They distanced themselves. And the police eventually arrested some of the ringleaders who were linked to Anjem Choudhury's group, Al-Muhajiroun. But think about the mindset required to do that. These young men, born in the UK, didn't see themselves as British citizens, subject to British law. They saw themselves as enforcers of Hakimiyyah on British soil. They believed they had the right, nay, the duty to enforce God's law over the Queen's law. This comes from the doctrine of al-wala wal-bara. Let's go into a deep dive. Al-wala wal-bara, loyalty and disavowal. This is a term you need to know. Al-wala wal-bara. It translates to loyalty to the Muslims and disavowal of the disbelievers. It is a theological concept heavily emphasized by Salafists and Wahhabis that says a Muslim's primary loyalty must be to the Ummah, the global Muslim community, and to God. And conversely, they must distance themselves from the reject the ways, customs, and friendship of kuffar, the non-believers. In the Western Republic, we rely on civic nationalism. We expect your loyalty to be to the Constitution, to the flag, to your fellow citizen, regardless of faith. We expect you to root for the home team. Al-wala wal-bara cuts right through that. It creates a psychological wall. It says, I am not one of you. I am in this land, but I'm not of this land. This is why we see self-segregation. This is why Douglas Murray, in his book, The Strange Death of Europe, talks about the exhaustion of the West. He argues that Europe has lost its own identity. It is consumed by guilt and self-doubt, while it is importing millions of people who have a very strong identity and zero guilt. Murray says, a continent which imports the world's peoples will also import the world's problems. If you have a population that believes it is religiously mandated to disavow the culture of the host nation, integration isn't just hard, it's theologically impossible. Part 4. The Bizarre Frontier. Fatwas in the Modern World. Now, let's take a detour into the Twilight Zone, because the incompatibility isn't just about big politics. It's about the weird, everyday clashes between a 7th century worldview and the 21st century life. We're talking about fatwas. A fatwa is a legal ruling given by an Islamic scholar, and in the age of the internet, we have seen proliferation of fatwas that show just how wide the gap is. The Pokemon panic. Remember Pokemon Go? Cute little monsters, right? Well, in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, the clerical establishment lost its mind. The General Secretariat of the Council of Senior Religious Scholars in Saudi Arabia renewed a fatwa declaring Pokemon Haram forbidden. Why? Evolution. The game involves monsters evolving. This promotes Darwinian theory, which contradicts the Islamic creation story. Polytheism, the monsters have powers that should belong only to God. Zionism, you can't make this up. Some clerics claim the symbols in the game, like the six-pointed stars, were secret Zionist propaganda to brainwash children. Gambling, because you spend money on items with uncertain outcomes. Come on, yo. Whew, fam, it's Pikachu. One of my favorite characters. It's not a Zionist plot, yo. Pikachu from Pokemon. But this shows the mindset. Everything viewed through the lens of halal versus haram. There is no neutral secular entertainment. Even a kid's game is a battlefield for the soul. The Mars mission ban. And it gets weirder, yo. A few years ago, the Mars One project was looking for volunteers to go on a one-way trip to Mars to colonize it. The General Authority of Islamic Affairs in the UAE issued a fatwa prohibiting Muslims from going to Mars. Really? Their reasoning? It is a suicide mission. Suicide is haram. Therefore, going to Mars is a sin. They said Islamic Committee expressed disdain that some volunteers want to leave the planet in order to escape punishment or evade standing before Almighty Allah for judgment. Just think about that. They thought people were going to Mars to hide from God. This is a clash between the Western spirit of exploration to boldly go and the religious legalism that seeks risk-taking as a violation of divine property, your body. The halal emoji crisis. But I'm not stopping there. Even the emojis aren't safe. There was a debate online and in forums about whether using emojis is haram. Why, you may ask? Because drawing living things, human faces, is forbidden in strict interpretations of Islam. Aniconism, it is seen as trying to mimic the creator. So we had developers creating halal emojis, faces with no eyes, or faces with beards and hijabs, to try and navigate this minefield. Why does this matter, you may ask? Because it shows the friction in the smallest details of life. You can't even use a smiley face without consulting a 12th century text. How do you integrate into a high-speed digital secular society? You're constantly tripping over invisible wires. Part 5. The human cost. The apostate and the reformer. We've laughed at the fatwas, we've analyzed the politics, but now I need to bring room down. I need to look you in the eye and tell you about the human cost of this incompatibility, because the people who suffer the most aren't the Western liberals. It's not Ben Affleck, it's the people inside the house who want to get out. The apostate, the ex-Muslim. In a free Western republic, religion is a revolving door. You can be a Catholic on Monday, a Buddhist on Wednesday, and an atheist on Friday. It's your right. In Islam, traditionally, it is a roach motel. You check in, but you don't check out. The penalty for Riba, apostasy, in Sharia is death. No other, just death. Now in the West, they can't legally execute you, but they can kill you socially. They can kill you psychologically, and sometimes they do try to kill you physically. Yasmin Mohammed's story. Let me tell you about Yasmin Mohammed. She's a Canadian, born in Vancouver, a Western citizen, but she didn't grow up in Canada. She grew up in a fundamentalist household that operated like a little Arabia on Canadian soil. She was beaten as a child, soles of her feet whipped for not memorizing the Quran perfectly. At age 19, she was forced into a marriage, not just to any conservative guy. She was forced to marry Essam Marzouk. She was whipped for not memorizing the Quran perfectly. At age 19, she was forced into a marriage, not just to any conservative guy. She was forced to marry Essam Marzouk. Who is Essam Marzouk? He was an operative for Al-Qaeda, a man connected to Bin Laden network. She lived with this man. She had a daughter with this man. In Canada, she eventually escaped. She took her daughter, changed their names, and went into hiding. She lives in fear to this day. Even though her husband was eventually imprisoned, she wrote a book called Unveiled: How the West Empowers Radical Muslims, and her message is devastating. She says, Western liberals, by screaming Islamophobia every time someone criticizes Islam, are actually abandoning people like me. She argues that when the West tolerates the cultural practices of fundamentalists in the name of diversity, they're tolerating the abuse of women and children. When Ben Affleck shouts, "Down Sam Harris," he isn't protecting the vulnerable Muslim woman. He's protecting the bearded patriarch who is oppressing her. Yasmin calls this the soft bigotry of low expectations. The West looks at the Muslim world and says, "Oh, well, violence and misogyny is just their culture. We have to respect it." Yasmin screams back, "No, I want freedom too. Why is freedom only for white women? Why do you support my oppressor?" The ex-Muslim underground. Yasmin isn't alone. Look at the research snippets from the UK Parliament evidence. A mixed faith lady who converted to Christianity. She faces intense social isolation and aggressive behavior from her family. Nabil came out as ex-Muslim to his wife. She threatened to take the children and leave him. Shano, experiencing honor-based violence for years. Mohammed Abad in Jordan, moderate country, he was sued for apostasy by his own father. He lost custody of his own kids. He had to flee the country. In London and New York in 2025, we have secret societies of ex-Muslims. They meet in basements. They vet each other like spies because they're terrified of infiltration. They're terrified that if their families find out that they drank a beer or stopped praying, they will be shipped back to Pakistan or Somalia for re-education. Or worse, this is the ultimate incompatibility. A democratic republic is built on the individual, the right of the individual to choose their destiny. The Islamist structure is built on collective, the Ummah, and the collective has the right to crush the individual who tries to leave. The reformers, Mecca versus Medina. So, you may ask, can this be fixed? Can Islam be reformed? Ayan Hirsi Ali, another powerhouse dissident, says it's possible, but only if we're honest about the text. She breaks Islam into two phases, Mecca and Medina. Mecca phase, the early years, Muhammad was weak. He had no army. The verses from this time are spiritual, peaceful. To you, your religion, and to me, mine. These are the verses the apologists quote on CNN. The Medina phase, Muhammad moves to Medina. He becomes a warlord and a statesman. He has an army. Verses change. They become the sword verses. Kill the idolaters wherever you find them. The problem, Hirsi Ali argues, is abrogation, nask. In Islamic theology, if two verses contradict, the later one cancels the earlier one. Guess which ones came later? The Medina verses, the violent ones. So the reform is incredibly hard because the violent, political, intolerant parts of the Quran are final draft of the revelation. To be a moderate, you essentially have to ignore the final commands of your God. And tell me, how's that compatible? The Sam Harris versus Ben Affleck moment. We have to touch on that cultural moment when, in real time with Bill Maher, 2014, Sam Harris versus Ben Affleck. Harris says, Islam is the mother lode of bad ideas. Affleck says, Affleck loses it, he slumps in his chair, red face, he calls it gross, racist, disgusting. This moment encapsulated the Western paralysis. Affleck represented the liberal blind spot. He could not separate the idea, Islam, from the people, Muslims. He thought attacking the ideology was a racist attack on the people. Harris was trying to make a crucial distinction. Ideas do not have rights. People have rights. Ideas do not have rights. People have rights. We can respect Muslim people while ruthlessly criticizing the bad ideas of Islam, like killing apostates or hating gays. But the West is so terrified of being called an Islamophobist or a racist that it refuses to criticize the bad ideas. And by doing so, it allows those bad ideas to fester and grow within its own borders. So, what is the conclusion? What is the verdict, you may ask? Hey, BamBam, so what's the verdict then? So we've peeled back the layers. We looked at the sovereignty trap, God versus the Constitution. We've looked at the economic fiction, the hypocrisy of Islamic finance. We've looked at the social collision, Hamtramck and the paradox of tolerance. We've looked at the human cost, the apostates and the woman. And the conclusion of this report, you may ask? Do I really need to spell it out for you? The data points to fundamental structural incompatibility between political Islamism, and the capitalist democratic republic. One system values the individual, the other values the ummah. One system values reason and debate, the other values revelation and submission. One system allows you to leave, the other demands your death if you try. Does this mean Muslims are incompatible? No. Millions of Muslims live in the West. They are our neighbors, our doctors, our friends. But how did they do it? They do it by privatizing their faith. They do it by ignoring the Medina verses. They do it by becoming Mecca Muslims. In the modern world, they essentially accept the Western deal. Your religion is a hobby, not a government. But the ideology, the books, the political of the brotherhood, it is a battering ram. And the West has left the gate open. We have a choice. We can continue the illusion. We can keep shaking the jar of oil and water, hoping it mixes, or we can stop. We can look at the separation, and we can decide that a tolerant society has the right, no, the duty to be intolerant of intolerance. And this is BamBam. This is RusNkaZ Show. Stay awake, stay dangerous, and stop shaking the jar.
Catch the wave, let your dreams ignite. In the world of business, reach new heights. Join the journey, hear the words unfold. BamBam's vision, turning stories to gold.